Welcome to Democracy Differently, the podcast about why democracy isn't working and how to fix it. I'm your host for today, Jess Sutherland, and today I have two amazing guests, Karen Celis, who is Professor of Political Science and Head of the Research Centre Democratic Futures at VUB University of Brussels, and Sarah Childs, a Professor of Politics and Gender at Edinburgh University and one of the PIs on the ERC Synergy grant QUALREP. They are both, of course, respected experts in their field and co-authored a book together called Feminist Democratic Representation, which won the Mackenzie Book Prize from the Political Studies Association. Today, they're both here to talk to us about just that, really, the representation of women in democracy. So, Karen and Sarah, thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
So, the first question that we ask everyone that comes onto our podcast is, in a sentence, what do you see as the biggest problem with democracy?
Okay, I'm going to jump in first. And I'm really concerned about a perception that just too many people seemingly don't care enough about democracy, that maybe we need to reconnect with democracy. I think also too many people are poorly represented. And I think, again, those two claims about seemingly not caring enough and being poorly represented are connected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And for me, it's like this double disconnect that Sarah already hinted at, like people disconnecting from politics, but also politicians disconnecting from the people in a way, which is a weird observation given that we live in populist times. But there is this double disconnect that worries me a lot.
Amazing, thanks. That was lovely, short and sweet. So if I could just jump into kind of, I guess, the crux of some of your work. So what's gone wrong with how women are represented in politics then?
Well, I think it's worth starting when we're thinking about democracies that historically women were formally excluded from those early democracies. And I mean, when I mean early, I mean from the early established democracies, the kind of countries that we live in. And then when they were allowed in, they entered institutions that had not been organised around the interests and the experiences of women, but had been organised around the political interests of men and designed to represent those interests. So in a sense, you're coming late to the game and the rules of the game have already been set. And so we've seen and continue to see democracies where women are less represented in terms of numbers, but oftentimes too, their political interests are marginalised, devalued, not at the centre of political debate.
And what our populist times again add to that problematic is then also this misrepresentation of women and kind of even weaponizing women's representation. So making claims about women and women's equality that actually serve Islamophobic and racist goals. So it's underrepresentation, it's misrepresentation, and then also this new kind of abusive misrepresentation and the weaponizing of women's representation.
Yeah, and in the book we talk about women being in receipt of, experiencing a poverty of representation, and I think that's tries to capture this deficiency. And I think just to add to that, in taking a slightly different approach, I think we need to recognise the rise of violence against women in politics, so gendered political violence as a means of resistance to women's gains, such as they have been, but also as a backlash as well. And I think Karen's comments about the kind of populist, authoritarian, anti-democratic times we're living in, we're seeing the contestation of women's right to be present in politics kind of re-articulated. And I think that's hugely, hugely problematic.
Yeah, and that's also highly problematic from a democratic point of view, right? It's really bad for women and actually, by extension, also other groups. But it's also extremely harmful for democracy because we have seen a huge democratization project, so to speak, by including more women in politics, by including more ethnic minorities in politics and other marginalized groups. And that is now undone through violence against politicians from that group. So it's, these matters are not at the margins of democracy and politics. They're very much at the heart of it, and de-democratization and anti-democratization comes through the gender door current times.
So in the last few decades, I think we've seen greater representation of women in parliaments globally, but that doesn't always mean that women are now represented, problem solved, and we can just kind of carry on. So could you explain a little bit why the increased presence of women in these spaces doesn't automatically mean that we've got equal representation?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I'd want to say, and I know Karen agrees with me on this, is that we do care about the numbers of women. I mean, you're right, we have seen improvements, but I think we shouldn't be complacent. There are a number of parliaments where we've seen either static numbers or actually fall back. So we need to keep our attention to the obstacles that women face when they're trying to participate, particularly, I think, in the times that we're living in. And I think the violence against women that I just spoke about is also part of the explanation for some of the increased difficulties or reasons why women may not be participating. But pointing to that idea of getting increasing numbers in, we do need to talk about parity. So there was also a complacency that 30% was kind of okay. And I think we need to recognise that the United Nations, the new CEDAW recommendation really is demanding equality, parity. But, you know, getting numbers of women in is the minimum, right? We need to think about how do we actually transform politics. And I don't just mean parliaments, I mean political parties and other organisations and institutions of politics need to be made gender sensitive. So if we look around the world, we can think about the way in which gender insensitivities characterise most of the places where politics takes place. And what we therefore need to do is, and this is where the international organisations around democracy and around parliaments have over the last 10 to 15 years really put a lot of effort towards gender sensitising our parliaments, going into parliaments, undertaking audits, finding out what's wrong, if you like, and then creating recommendations. And you've seen that, whether that's with the Interparliamentary Union, UN Women, the CPA, Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, actually undertaking very sort of specific audits with experts and practitioners and with the parliamentary staff and members to really identify a whole programme of reform for these institutions. Because if we don't change the institutions, we're assuming that women can just fit in. And that's not going to happen because we know the ways in which these institutions operate, whether that's to do with their infrastructure, whether it's to do with their cultures. And I think actually to parliaments where there has been attention, political parties are the next, if you like, era of this kind of gender sensitising reform. So we mustn't assume that women can easily access, nor easily fit in with institutions. Institutions need to be radically reformed.
Amazing, thanks. And touching on that kind of diversification of women's interests being represented, if women's particular interests aren't represented, or they're kind of seen as marginal issues, I guess, compared to the real issues in politics. What does this mean for how women experience politics, either day to day or as kind of women that are working within the political sphere?
Yeah, so recognizing this diversity is essential to the quality. For the quality of politics and decision making. If for a long time, women's representation was understood as being realized when a few good women, a few left-wing progressive women were in parliament, and that there was, like, for instance, a progressive abortion law. Box ticked. Women are represented and well represented. And again, I'm not saying that having an abortion law that respects women's bodily rights and integrity isn't important. It is absolutely important. Numbers and having women there, presence is important, but it's not enough. And why would we expect that having a few women and having a particular law in place would be good enough for women? this is something we would never think of when we would think about men's representation. We would not say like, okay, men are well represented when we have a few men in politics and there's a law that fits their interests, right? So actually this full acknowledgement that women are a diverse group, intersectionally diverse, but also ideological diverse, and which also means that they have diverging interests and conflicting interests. The full recognition of that is actually a full recognition of them being political and political subjects and their issues of political importance. So it's considering women and their issues as fully political, as part of the puzzle of who gets what, when, and where, which is the fundament of politics, right? So that is at stake with at stake when we think about women's diversity. It's not a problem. It's the very reason why we have politics in the first place.
Yeah. And I think I would just add to that in feminist democratic representation, we also talk about the institutional responsibility to represent women, that it's not just the work of women representatives who get elected to respond to the diverse interests that women voice in society, but actually we want all our representatives to know more about women's concerns and to care more that women's interests are realised in politics. Because again, otherwise you are divorcing what women's interests are from the political agenda and making a particular group, here descriptive representatives, responsible for enacting policies that meet those needs and interests or reflect those experiences. And that's not right either. So I think it's that sense about what, we need to reframe this question about under what conditions do all of our representatives better represent women? How do we get them to know and care more about those interests?
Amazing, thanks. And something you've touched on a little bit there is that it's often the kind of most vocal voices that get heard on the political stage. That could be vocal women, or it could be that women are being almost drowned out by men there. But these voices, the ones that get heard the most, are often the most well-resourced, well-organised, those sorts of things. So how can we kind of ensure that women's voices who are directly affected by the issues genuinely are heard, and it's not just those who can shout the loudest?
It's a big question to answer, and I think we need to break it down to make it manageable. What we need in civil society is opportunities for more political talk, so that people can, in a sense, constitute their interests through dialogue and through interaction with others, so that they can begin to feel strongly about knowing what their interests are. But we're also then thinking about how does the public debate feed into the institutions or the formal electoral politics. And of course, that opens up a whole series of questions about the relationship between representative, participatory and deliberative democracy. But if we just take parliaments for the moment as they are, we can think about what additional responsibilities those institutions can have to find those people whose voices are not often heard. Because oftentimes people say, you talk about hard to reach groups. And actually, I once heard a witness in a committee session in Parliament say, we're not hard to reach, we're just easy to ignore. And I think that concept about being easy to ignore really reveals the power imbalances within society. And I think the way in which parliaments can, if they're not careful, just listen to the voices that are the loudest or the most proximate. And I think if we had a better understanding of this responsibility to ensure that the easy to ignore are brought in. And of course, it's not just about hearing, it's about listening. And some of the other work that Karen and I have done since Feminist Democratic Representation has been to think about what does good democratic listening entail? Because often you can include and you can register what people are saying, but we working with this idea of processing in some way that information and being accountable for what you have done with it, even if that cannot always imply that you have met the stated interests of any one group, because as has already been said, you can't sort of deliver everything for everybody all of the time. Democracy is trying to find answers, right? But I think that notion of inclusion as voice isn't sufficient. We have to have listening and processing of those contributions such that people feel represented. We call it in the round, but we think about representation as a mélange, not just bodies, descriptive. It's not substantive, getting things, the outcomes that you want. It's also about feeling symbolically and effectively represented.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and going back to the question of like the loudest voices, because very much indeed that is a problem, and Sarah already hinted at it. It's this issue of proximity. And it's not only about the loudest voices and the easy to ignore. It's also that our politicians really need to have some familiarity with some claims and seeing some groups and some claims as legitimate. And again, to the problem of disconnect that we discussed at the beginning of our talk. When you have a very homogeneous elite, if you have an elite, a political elite that is predominantly white, male, cisgender, wealthy, highly educated, the law degrees, and so on and so forth, if you have that kind of homogeneity in your political elite, that group is far away, is very detached from some groups in society who are differently positioned, and their claims therefore will sound weird. Our political elites will not have any familiarity with those claims. And therefore they will not see them as legitimate claims, and then they will get ignored, and they can be as loud as they want. But there's no connection, no way of connecting to it, and that is what our book Feminist Democratic Representation is all about. Like, how can we create those connections, and how can we make creating those connections the task of our political elites, so that they can connect with, really listen to, democratically listen to, and actually include them and their ideas in fair policy and decision making.
Amazing, thanks. And if we move a little bit away, I guess, from the kind of parliaments, elections, those sorts of things, because of course being a part of a democracy isn't just those things. We do a wide range of like civic and democratic participation. So how do you think all of these issues that you've discussed so far really affect the ways that women may want to participate, or the opportunities that they get to participate?
I think I would hark back to some of those very classic feminist critiques around recognising the public-private divide, the idea that the public is a space for men who talk and the private is the space for women who care. And this idea of, to what extent can we have greater expectations for participation, and in fact participating in more deliberative spaces too, if there is still an unequal division of labour in the domestic sphere and particularly in the caring sphere. So I think we have to really problematise what other opportunities are made available within society that might link sort of the public or civil society with other institutions, because of that difficulty of reconciling the additional time, the additional resources, which might be both monetary and also status linked, to the ability of people to participate. So we do, I think, have to go local to begin with. I talked before about the idea of trying to think about greater public discourse. Again, classic studies always documented women being more likely to participate in activities that, from a feminist perspective or through a feminist lens, might well be considered political, but from a traditional political science or political institutions perspective would say, well, they're just involved in the school board or in the local community. That wasn't politics, because they had a very narrow definition of politics. So for me, I think we have to be much more alert to the possibilities in different spaces and in different ways that women can participate. But actually, fundamentally, there is overhanging all of this or saturating all of this, the difficulty of the differential divisions of labour. And that's something I think is really, really quite significant. And I'm sure Karen will want to jump in on more of those other sort of spaces and places.
Yeah, and what we see over and over again is that democratic innovations of all sorts, they are designed as if we live in gender equal worlds, which obviously we don't live in gender equal worlds. But these democratic innovations are designed as if there is gender equality, and as if the remaining tiny inequalities can be resolved through some extra recruitment or another small intervention that remedies a so-called unexpected inequality as outcome, right? So they are designed as if gender equality is in place, and then surprise, surprise, there's gender inequality once these democratic innovations are enacted and implemented. So the solution to this is that you actually co-design these democratic innovations with groups that experience inequality and the real inequalities that are there, so that they can be taken into account when designing these democratic innovations. Otherwise, we will keep on repeating this process of developing something and then have to remedy for gender inequality. We have to, co-design these democratic innovations, starting from the reality that there is inequality, there is gender inequality, but there are also other key inequalities that have to be taken into account, socioeconomic inequalities. And, we know the long list of inequalities, right? So that's a different way of approaching the process of developing democratic innovation.
Amazing, thanks. So if we could talk briefly about your book then. I guess we can start from the very front of the book. So the cover of your book has a yellow dress on it. And obviously this dress is meant to be more than just a symbol of femininity. It actually gives rise to a really important analogy that you use throughout the book. So could you say more? I don't want to reveal too much.
I mean, I was trying to think, Karen, about where it started from, because in a way it became really a central way of us working through what it was we wanted to say in a book that was perhaps more theoretical, a book length study than the work we'd done before, but it enabled us to play with this idea about being well represented. So Karen and I, there was a period of time where Karen and I dressed quite similarly, and then I guess I'm slightly more traditional. Karen wears more colourful clothes. I like to think of her as my rock chick kind of friend. And when we were thinking about how have we previously thought about when women are well represented, we talked about numbers. And then the kind of politics and gender trajectory of research went to substantive. So you knew you were well represented when your interests were met. But of course, as you've already laid bare through your questioning and us through our answers, is that assumes that there is a risk of assuming that women have the same interests and therefore they can be met in a very simple kind of way. And so we began to play with this idea that we didn't say who was going to do the shopping, but in my head, Karen had been sent out to get me an outfit and I wanted a black dress. And I told her this is what I wanted. And she knows that's what I want because predominantly that's all that's in my wardrobe. But she returns with this yellow dress and I'm dissatisfied. So in a sense, the analogy is that I don't think she's represented me well by bringing back to me the wrong dress in a very classic account of sort of poor substantive representation. But because we were working with this idea of representation being a melange of kind of concepts or dimensions, this idea was, well, when would I feel that she had done a good enough shopping trip? So like if she'd been a bit slapdash and she'd just been to 2 shops and brought me a yellow dress, I could say that the process of her shopping hadn't been good enough. So maybe I sent her away again. And she goes to more shops this time, and she knows, because I've restated what my interests are, that I really don't want this yellow dress. But then what happens is she comes back and she says, look, I'm really, this is the best at this time. This is what I can deliver for you. And it's really enables us to think, under what conditions would I be satisfied? Is it because I know that she's heard and listened to what I want, that she has engaged in activities that make me feel that she took my concerns seriously? She has to be accountable. She has to make a case for why this dress is the one that, I need to feel good about. And then to try to encapsulate that, I went looking for a yellow dress that I might feel satisfied with. And I came across about a £900, very pale yellow Vivienne Westwood dress. And I could accept that. That would be a yellow dress I would have worn had Karen produced that for me. And that enabled us to really think through this idea of the mélange and this idea that one can be well represented, even in the absence of substantive representation, under certain kinds of conditions. And that's what we were really trying to explore. And I hope that's a good explanation. But Karen, feel free to add to that story. But that really, for me, encapsulate what we were trying to achieve by including that, because we'd worked with it as we were writing the book, and we took an extra year to finish this book. So that yellow dress analogy really helped us to crystallize that final kind of revision from the penultimate draft to the final draft. It really helped me. The reason I'm looking away is I've got it on my wall and I'm looking at it now. And I should just do a quick shout out to Hazel McCoubrey, a feminist illustrator, who rather had to listen to us excruciatingly try to describe the image we wanted. And she obviously produced a fantastic dress. But Karen, please feel free to add to this if you'd like.
No, it's a great explanation. It's really exactly how, and you also hear how much fun we had writing the book, right? And taking our time, slow science. So we enjoyed it a lot, and it really captures this conceptual shift from content to process. And in the book, of course, we. It sounds superficial, like a yellow dress, but of course we also talk about complex proceduralism and so on and so forth. We have done our homework, right? So, but it captures that shift, and under which circumstances, with which process in place, can we agree that there's a good representation, notwithstanding you didn't get what you initially wanted, and in this. We put a lot of stress in our book on accountability. And we believe that accountability is one of the weakest links in the chain of democratic representation. It's actually not very well theorized, and for sure there are not enough moments in our political processes and institutions where accountability can be done. Well done. And so in our book, we develop also this new moment of account given, where we expect all elected representatives as a collective. So not as individual politicians explaining to citizens what they did and couldn't do because the other one didn't allow them, No, as a collective, taking responsibility for the decision taken and explaining why some opinions transformed and shifted, why certain people can't have what they initially thought was good for them, or still is good for them, but it's not realistic at that political moment, and so on and so forth. So this moment of collective account giving to the people is, I believe, a very, very important section of our book. So the democratic listening is, and also I think our thinking about accountability really adds something to our current state of affairs.
Amazing, thanks. And how do you think things have changed then, since you first published the book? Yeah, I'm sorry. I know that's a very difficult question.
Not for the better.
Yeah, I know. It's Karen said this a couple of years ago, actually, so I'm just going to repeat it. Is that I don't think we envisage such a rapid turn to the kind of polarized, populist, anti-equalities politics and politicians that we see around us. I think we had an optimistic feel when we were writing this book, and maybe that's linked to slow science, and also because we focused on rethinking representation rather than necessarily how does one bring it about. But I think we're obviously dealing with in a context when actually too many of our representatives will disregard groups of people and not think that they necessarily need to be well represented. So despite the articulation of this idea of ruling in the interests of the masses, actually who constitutes that group of people would be very exclusionary and would not care about precisely those who we think elected representatives should be knowing more about and caring more about. So it's actually, I think for me, we underestimated the backlash for sure. And I think had at that point underestimated the entwining of anti-democratic and anti-equalities, because the terrain on which they are operating is often the anti-equalities. They're deploying anti-equalities rhetoric to their own instrumental de-democratizing ends. So I think in a way we have to take another step back and think about what is it that needs to be put in place to ensure that there is a demand for a different kind of politics now. And I think we were hoping to work with a more tolerant time where the realization of rights was one that was a more broadly shared view. And I think, unfortunately, that isn't where we are now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we wrote this book when equality was still a hooray word and an unquestioned democratic value, and that has dramatically shifted the last couple of years. Yeah. It's totally okay now to voice that equality is not that important and it's harmful and to democracy. So yeah. And when we were writing this book, that was not the case. That was definitely, these voices were there already for sure, and we were fully aware of them. We are following politics, but it's now becoming a hegemonic perspective on that equality and democracy are in tension.
And what really worries us in the work we're currently doing is that those who we might have thought to have defended equality may be more reticent now, because in trying to compete with those others for whom equality, or rather inequality, is something they are happily embracing. But we worry that those who might previously have been more staunch defenders or advocates of equality and rights will concede that in an attempt to be more competitive against those for whom inequality is something to, and division is something to be proud of. And that's also, I think that definitely is a shift that I don't think was there at the time, that actually it would be a concession. If we have to, we'll take a step away from equality to secure our electoral success, or to try to compete in democratic terms with the anti-democrats. Now, I think if that's, we call it death by 1,000 cuts, don't we, Karen, in a recent piece, that you give a little bit of equality over here, give a little bit of rights over here to try and be competitive. And actually, that's a terrible state of affairs. And one we think that just doesn't take the importance of equality as a core democratic principle seriously enough. It's not one that you can minimize or throw away or try not to sort of put attention on. You can't trade democracy and equality.
Amazing, thanks. And I guess that really gets to the heart of one of the problems that we have with representation is that elections are in part about securing votes, right? And so you need to appeal to your established base and also further than that. So what do you think representation should look like then? If we can put the bad things behind us and really imagine what we want it to look like, what should that look like?
Yeah, and I think that, Political representation has to be a way, and shown also to be a way of reaching fair and just decisions.
Yeah.
And that is really, it's about this. It's about conflict and debate, yes, but then also finding ways of reconciling views and finding some kind of temporary middle ground, like something we can agree on for the time being, and then we continue our discussion to find even better ways and revise what we, this idea of political representation being a constant attempt of reaching fair and just decisions for all, in full acceptance that we will make mistakes and we won't get it right each and every time, but no problem. It's a continuous process where we recalibrate, reconnect with different groups in society to keep the conversation going, and it's an inclusive conversation. Yes, that's in my. But that's an ideal, right? And it's a theoretical idea. This is, and that's something that we work with in our book quite a lot, like representation as it should be. But it's only if we have those visions and if we make them explicit, and it's sometimes a bit uncomfortable to make those visions explicit, because you risk sounding very naive and utopian, but we have to formulate those visions and make explicit those utopias in order then to start working towards them. And this is what Sarah and I are now working on this idea of feminist democratic design, where you start from those utopias or ideals, and then you start thinking in a co-constructive, co-designing way, like how can we design new processes and institutions and practices and devices to come closer to that ideal.
Amazing, thanks. And that leads on to one of my other questions I had for you is, of course, the book wasn't your first venture or your last venture into this kind of design, institutional design space. So could you say a little bit more about the work that you have both done and are doing, and what that means for the representation of women?
Yeah, so Feminist Democratic Representation, if you like, it started as a book that was going to be a reflection back on the pieces of work that we'd done over the, I don't know, was it a decade and a half, 2 decades, when we first met, as PhD students over a gin and tonic, and realised we were doing similar kinds of work. Just a shout out to European conferences, that's where we first met. And we began thinking about substantive representation. Then we tried to explore what that meant through the presence of ideologically diverse, particularly conservative women. And then we started thinking that, we'll just write something that kind of encapsulates what we've done and put it into a book. And as we did that, we realised that there were these bigger questions, deeper theoretical questions we wanted to return to, including going back to some of the really classic work by Iris Marion Young that we had both independently, obviously, used for our PhDs. And we got very infused by thinking about how to re-engage on a deeper level with that concept. But as we were doing that, it then prompted us, as research often does, a whole series of other questions. And at that point, we were increasingly reading about the democratic design work, and particularly Mike Saywood's 2021 book, but also bringing to those kind of questions the gender sensitizing Parliament's very practical work that I'd been involved in writing a very practical report in the House of Commons. I've done quite a lot of gender-sensitive parliamentary audits with international organisations. So on the one hand, there was this very theoretically focused work that we were doing. And then I was doing this, and Karen was in Belgium working and observing things going on there. And it was like, if we brought those together, then we were speaking to 2 sets of literature, the politics and gender literature, but also the democratic innovations and design literatures. And that got us thinking about the role of equality and inequality in that, in those debates, in that literature, particularly that democratic design and innovation literature. And we just felt that there was something in that. We felt there was an inadequacy in how equality was being dealt with. And so we kind of built on our feminist democratic representation work, using and very much owing a huge debt to Mike Sayward and his idea of democratic design. But we felt that in order for that to be fruitful and to really address the democratic deficiencies of our kind of societies, we had to make it feminist. And that's what we're currently working on, by bringing in Anne Phillips's ideas around the unequal, unconditional equals and inequalities, and saying, actually, if you make democratic design feminist, what you're doing for all designers is really addressing that intertwining of democracy, de-democratization, democratic deficits, democratic incompleteness, however you want to phrase it, democratic malaise, with this appreciation of how inequalities prevent the redress of those. And so that's really where we're working at the moment. And we've had a few pieces out. So that also then feeds into this QUALREP project. I'll try and be very quick, but it's a 5-country comparison: Sweden, the UK, Belgium, Portugal, Poland, looking at the quality of women's representation. So we're bringing our feminist democratic design, more theoretical work, also to these empirical comparative research project with the ERC, and that Karen is on that project as well. And yeah, that's what we're currently doing, gathering data this year.
Amazing, thanks. If we could move into the more quickfire round now then. So here we like to ask quick questions, and if you give a very short and sweet answer to them. So the first one I have for you is, will our democracies change for the better or the worse in the near future?
Want to go first?
Me?
Yeah.
The worst.
Down. Yeah, I think so too. For the near future, for sure.
Yeah.
Have to be optimistic for the medium and longer term.
Yeah, and also as political scientists, we have an obligation to remain positive, in the sense of that we have to put all our knowledge into thinking about solutions to save democracy. So as an individual, as a person, I'm very pessimistic about current politics, but as a political scientist, I have to be optimistic in the sense of we will be able to find solutions. So that was a long answer to a short.
Oh, sorry, yeah, that was quick fire, wasn't it?
It's okay, it happens all the time on the podcast. So what's one thing you wish political representatives understood better about what good representation of women actually looks like? Okay,
I had 3 words: include, listen, and process what you've listened to. So include, listen, process.
Yeah, and to add to that, I would add like this heterogeneity and connecting with different groups of women, and accountability.
Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks. And we've obviously spoken a lot about democratic design today, but is there anything our listeners can practically do themselves as individuals?
Engage. Do engage in politics one way or another.
Yeah. And I think to commit to a kind of political talk that resists the idea of polarization. I think we have to see each other as the kind of equal democrats that we need to be if we want to live in a democratic society. And that notion of committing to being a democrat means, I think, it has to mean more than wishing to beat the opponent in that very kind of adversarial, masculinized, kind of polarized fashion that we currently see around us. I just don't think that's helpful. I think it's the very opposite of helpful.
Amazing, thanks. And I think that probably leads on to the final question that we ask every guest. So if you had to pick one thing for democracy to do differently, what would it be and why?
I think I want to make reference to the work of my PhD student, Alyssa, who is talking about how politics need to embrace the idea of care for the other people in our society, and just to sort of illustrate that, everything I hate about British politics at the moment is this hyper-masculinized style, shouting, tabloid politics, individual egos, party first, extreme adversarialism. This is all at the cost of representation. And I think if we took more seriously ideas of care and politics, then I think we'd go a long way to having a better democratic society.
And I totally agree with that. Care and democracy is such an important linkage. Yeah.
Amazing, thank you. A lovely note to end on for us, and hopefully a little bit optimistic. So Karen and Sarah, thanks so much for coming today.
Thank you, Jessica.
Thanks very much, Jessica.
And if you enjoyed the podcast, please remember to subscribe. And I've been your host today, Jess Sutherland. Thanks so much for tuning in.